The interrogation room smelled like burnt coffee and someone else's adrenaline. I sat across from two federal agents who kept asking me the question in different configurations, and the dog. We'd decided to call him Plum, after the town. Sat next to my boot and looked at the agents like he was bored on my behalf. The question they kept circling was, "Who are you?" I told them I was nobody. They didn't like that answer, but they kept writing it down anyway. Let me back up. I have spent the better part of 4 years being an extremely productive asset for a man I call the barber. Not his real name, never his real name. But the barber is precise, methodical, and he has never once given me a job I couldn't finish, which means he understands exactly what I am even when I forget. I do not like forgetting. It makes the remembering harder. The arrangement is straightforward. I accumulated a debt. The specific nature of that debt involves a Russian criminal syndicate, their financial reserve, and a level of property damage that I will not itemize here. The point is, I owed $30 million, and the only currency I have that's worth anything is the particular set of skills my government spent a decade installing in me, before they decided they'd rather pretend I didn't exist. So I worked the debt. A string of international assignments, each one clean, each one finite. The men I was sent after were not innocent men. Each one was in some measurable way worse than me. That's the threshold I've always used. It's not a noble threshold, and I'm not presenting it as one. Keeps the light on in a part of my mind that I'm not willing to let go dark, so I use it, and I don't interrogate it too carefully at 2 in the morning. Problem with living like that is what it costs the people around you. Becca knew, in the way that perceptive people who love you always know. She didn't know the specifics. She knew the shape of it. She knew that when my phone rang in the middle of the night, I'd be gone by morning, and back in a week with bruised ribs, and a story that didn't quite connect at the seams. She'd put the kids to bed alone 4 nights out of 7. She learned to read the tension in my shoulders the way meteorologists read pressure systems. Not because she wanted that skill, but because it was from Fafen she needed to survive being married to me. I was not a good husband that year. I was present in the technical sense. I was home more than I was away. Presence without attention is just furniture. And Becca deserved considerably more than furniture. Brady had turned 17 and discovered that I didn't know any of his friends' names. Sammy was 9 and had started asking Becca questions she shouldn't have had to answer alone. My father David was 73 years old, sharper than anyone in any room gave him credit for, and quietly furious at me in a way that only fathers manage. Not anger exactly, more like a sustained and patient disappointment that believed in my eventual correction. He'd call me on Tuesday evenings and we'd talk about nothing in particular for 20 minutes. And then he'd say something offhand that would sit in my chest for a week. And Harry, my brother Harry, the least surprised person in any room always. Harry had opinions about my situation that he delivered primarily through silence and the occasional extremely direct statement that I'd spend 3 days unpacking. Point is, my family needed a week of me, not the other me, just Hutch. The one who could be wrong about things, slow at things, bad at water slides, the human one. So I called the barber and told him I needed a vacation. He said, and I am quoting precisely, "Trouble follows you the way weather follows a front. You understand that?" I told him I understood it. I told him I was going to Plummerville anyway. He paused, long enough that I could hear him thinking. Then he exhaled through his nose, one of his tells. He said, "Don't piss off Lendina." I told him I didn't know who Lendina was. He said, "Exactly. I should have asked more questions. The honest truth is I heard the name, filed it under low probability threat, and moved on. My mind was on the drive. On whether Sammy would get carsick on the mountain stretch, whether Brady would spend the whole trip with headphones on, whether Becca would let me hold her hand without it, feeling like an obligation I'd manufactured. Wild Bill's majestic midway and water park, 40 acres set against a ridgeline of pines, in the tourist town of Plummerville, with a main street that sold saltwater taffy and fudge, and t-shirts with cartoon bears on them. I'd been there as a kid. My father had taken Harry and me one summer, when the world seemed larger and slower, and the roller coaster seemed fast. I wanted to give my kids that version of a memory, the kind you don't get to plan, you only get to be present for. We drove up on a Thursday. Becca had the passenger seat, and she was reading, and the late afternoon light through the window was hitting the side of her face in a way I have no language adequate for. Sammy was asleep behind me. Brady was not asleep, but was doing a credible impression of it. My father was following in his own car with the dog, a scraggly terrier mix of unclear provenance that had appeared outside our house 3 weeks earlier, and simply decided to live with us. The dog had opinions about everything. He and my father had already reached an understanding that I suspected was deeper than anything I had going with either of them. I pulled into the motel at 5 in the afternoon. Air smelled like pine sap and fried dough, and for approximately 45 minutes I felt like a normal man. Then we went to the arcade. The arcade was on the main strip between a miniature golf course and a funnel cake stand. Loud the way arcades are supposed to be loud. Machines, bells, the specific frequency of children in the presence of flashing lights and the possibility of prizes. Sammy made a beeline for the claw machines. Brady drifted toward the racing simulators with the careful nonchalance of someone who is interested, but would prefer to seem otherwise. I was watching Sammy work the claw when I heard the shift. There is a specific quality to the ambient noise of a public space when something goes wrong. It's not a loud thing. It's a subtraction, a brief quiet in the wrong place, a catch in the rhythm. I've been noticing it since before I could name it, and I've never been wrong about it. I looked up. 3 older boys, 16 or 17, local by the look of them. The kind of teenagers who understand they are large in a small town and have spent 2 years learning what that's worth. One of them had Brady's shoulder in a grip designed to look casual, and Brady's jaw was set in a way that told me he was deciding whether to say something he'd regret. The tallest one, Wyatt Martin's son, Max, I found out later, had knocked a stuffed animal out of Sammy's arms. Pink bear. She'd been carrying it since the car ride. I watched Max say something to Brady. Watched Brady look away, which is what you do when you're 17, and you've been taught that the better option is to absorb it. And I watched Max's friend kick the bear across the floor. I watched Sammy's face do the thing faces do when 9-year-old girls are trying very hard not to cry in public. Was across the arcade in 4 steps. I didn't put my hands on anyone. I want to be precise about that. I picked up the bear. I handed it back to Sammy. I looked at Max and his friends with the particular expression I've been told is either calm or terrifying depending on your orientation. And I said, "Find somewhere else to be." Max's friend said something I don't need to reproduce here. And then his friend slapped Sammy's hand when she reached for the bear again. That was the moment. Not a rage moment. Not a red curtain moment. Just a very clean clarification of the geometry of the situation. I took the hand. I applied a specific pressure to a specific joint. The boy sat down on the floor, which was what his elbow was suggesting, and I handed Sammy the bear, and I told Brady to take his sister to the funnel cake stand. Thought that was going to be the end of it. It was not. By the next morning, the shape of Plummerville had rearranged itself around us in a way that I recognized. Before I could explain what I was recognizing, the motel owner was too polite. The woman at the park ticket window didn't hold eye contact for more than a second. A sheriff's cruiser rolled past the motel twice before 9 in the morning. Sheriff Abel, as I'd learn, though at the time, he was just a silhouette-tinted glass, moving at the pace of something that's already decided. I'd spent enough years reading environments to know when an environment was reading me back. But I told myself I was on vacation. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself that Becca had looked genuinely relaxed at breakfast, a specific relaxation I hadn't seen in months, and that I was not going to dismantle it by running threat assessments on a funnel cake town. We went to the park, and the park was legitimately good. That's the part I want you to understand. It was a real morning. Not a performance of normalcy. Actual normalcy, the kind you can't manufacture, that either shows up or doesn't. Park was worn at the edges, the way amusement parks are, when they've been running on love and thin margins for 30 years. And that wornness was part of what made it right. It smelled like chlorine and machine grease, and cotton candy in equal measure. My father won a stuffed alligator at a ring toss booth that he did not remotely need, and was clearly delighted by. He carried it under his arm for the rest of the morning, with the dignity of a man who has earned the right to be pleased about small things. He went on the main water slide twice, and pretended both times that it was a merely adequate experience, which meant he was going to want to go again. Sammy wanted to ride everything. She had a methodology. She would look at each ride for precisely 7 seconds, determine her verdict, and either move toward it or cross it off some internal list. I rode a small roller coaster with her that I am not going to claim was impressive, but which was faster than I expected, and produced from me, involuntarily, a sound that made Sammy laugh so hard she had to hold the grab bar with both hands. Becca laughed at something I said, midway through the morning. A real laugh, not a courtesy laugh. I stored it the way you store things you're afraid of losing. Then the barber called. I stepped away from the group and took the call behind the fun house, in the narrow gap between the building and the fence, where the noise from the midway was muffled to a low wash. The barber's voice was the same as always, dry, precise, the emotional temperature of a ledger being balanced. He told me Plummerville had been a smuggling corridor for 12 years. Drugs, weapons, some biochemical material he was vague about, in a way that meant he wasn't being vague. He was being deliberately imprecise because he thought I might do something irreversible if I had the specifics. The operation was run by a woman named Lendina. He told me about Lendina. I stood behind the funhouse while the carousel music played, and he described someone who had built an empire on the methodology I'd spent years working against. Invisible ownership, local enforcement, debts used as leashes, violence calibrated to stay just below the threshold that draws federal attention. She owned Sheriff Abel outright. She had Wyatt Martin, the park operator, on a generational debt his dead father had left him. The way you leave someone a bad back, gradually, completely, without any mechanism for refusal. The whole town was a machine with her at the center. And it'd been running so smoothly for so long that nobody inside it remembered there had been anything different. At the end of it, the barber's voice had an edge I recognized, not warning. Assessment. You've already touched it, he said. I told him it was one incident in an arcade. He said, Wyatt Martin's son was in that arcade. I said nothing. Abel already knows your name, he said. Shh. You should leave today, this afternoon. Don't stop for gas on the way out. I looked back through the funhouse gap at my family. Becca was buying Sammy a snow cone. My father had the alligator tucked under his arm and was telling Brady something that was making Brady smile in spite of himself. The dog was sitting on his father's shoe. I told the barber I'd think about it. He made the sound he makes when he knows I've already decided and is conserving the energy he'd waste arguing. I didn't leave that afternoon. I went back to my family, and I rode 2 more rides, and I ate bad carnival food, and I didn't say anything about what the barber had told me. Because Becca needed that afternoon to be what it was, and I genuinely thought, that I could manage the situation without it touching them. I have been wrong about things before. This was one of the larger ones. I was on a rental boat the next morning, alone, working through what I knew and what I needed to know, when Abel's men hit me from the reeds on the east bank. 4 of them. They'd done this before. The approach angle told me that, the way professionals' movements carry the memory of previous iterations. 3 of them. In the water. The 4th had a knife that caught my left hand before I could redirect his elbow, and I lost the tip of my pinky finger somewhere in that lake. And the cold water was useful for about 30 seconds before the cold became its own problem. I made it back to the dock. I wrapped my hand with the kit from the boat compartment, sat on the dock for 4 minutes, let the information settle into something I could use. Here is what I had. A family I was not going to leave. A man called the barber, who would help if I asked but whose help would come with a bill I wasn't sure I wanted to pay. A father who was 73 and sharp, and a brother who picked up on the first ring. Harry said. How bad? I told him about the finger. He was quiet for 2 seconds, he said. I'll be there by nightfall. Start without me if you have to. Harry has always had a clarity of purpose that I've admired and occasionally envied. He's also extraordinarily good with a katana, which is a sentence I understand sounds implausible, but which is simply, flatly true, and which has been relevant on more occasions than I would have predicted. I called the barber back. I told him I was staying. He said, I know. I asked him to tell me everything he had on Lendina's operation in Plummerville. Took 6 seconds. I counted, and then he did. The warehouse was on the service road north of the park, an ugly building with corrugated metal walls and a loading dock that faced a stand of pine trees, away from the highway. Lendina's money came through Wyatt's Park in cash. Admission receipts, merchandise, concession stands, and the real product moved through the service house tunnels, under the grounds and out to the warehouse, and from there north and east by truck. It was a clean system. The park was a perfect front, because Wyatt's father had built it legitimately, which meant the financial history was real, and legitimate history is the best cover there is. Wyatt had been trying to get out. That's the part that landed in me differently than the rest. I've known men caught inside things they didn't choose, trying to find a door in a room that has no doors, making the calculations you make when you're outnumbered, and the walls keep moving. The calculations are small and they compound over time, and eventually they become the texture of your life. I understood Wyatt Martin without having met him yet. When he'd told Lendina his last payment was made and he wanted out, she had Abel kidnap Sin's son Max, his own son, as leverage. I drove to the warehouse that evening. I moved through the pine trees on the north side where the loading dock cameras had a blind spot. The barber had told me, and I'd verified it with my own eyes on the way in. Abel's men were inside with Max in a back room. The boy was sitting in a chair, arms crossed, trying to look like he wasn't afraid, and not quite getting there. He was 16. He'd spent the afternoon being terrified, and he was doing his best, which is all you can ask of a 16-year-old in that position. Put Abel's men on the floor. I spared Abel himself, who was at the far end of the warehouse, making a phone call when I came through, and who I stopped with a specific application of force that left him functional and clear on the conversation we were about to have. I soaked Lendina's cash, approximately $2 million in bundled bills on a wooden pallet, with gasoline from the yellow can near the loading dock. I lit a road flare, stood in front of Abel, and I gave him one instruction. Let the boy walk out, call off your people, and I'll take my family and leave. If he reached for Max again, or if his people moved on my family before we were on the highway, I'd drop the flare, and he could explain to Lendina why her money smelled like charcoal. Abel told me I didn't understand what I was doing. I told him I understood it precisely. He told his men to stand down. Max walked out. I walked out behind him. Then I looked back through the door and saw one of Abel's men reaching for Max again. The kind of reflexive escalation that some men cannot stop, even when stopping is the only thing that saves them. I made a different decision than the one I'd planned. I went back in. I finished it. I left Abel alive because I'm not at a place in my life where I kill local law enforcement for being corrupt. But every other man in that warehouse made a choice in the last seconds available to them, and they made the wrong one. Then I dropped the flare. The building went up fast. Abel was in the parking lot when the secondary explosion caught him, and the burns he took were significant, and they were going to be significant for the rest of his life. And I made peace with that as I drove out of the tree line and back toward Plummerville, parked in the motel lot, checked on my family. Becca was reading in the room. Sammy was asleep. Brady was pretending to be asleep, badly. My father was sitting on the small porch with the dog in his lap looking at the ridgeline in the dark. He looked at my wrapped hand when I came around the corner. He didn't say anything about it. He moved the dog over and made room on the step. We sat for a while. The pine ridgeline was barely visible against the sky. The carousel music from the park was shut down for the night, and the silence where it had been was its own kind of presence. She's going to come for us now, he said. Not a question. Yes, I said. He nodded. He kept looking at the ridgeline. Well, he said, in the way he says things he has already processed and accepted. Then we'd better make sure the park is ready. I want to tell you something about my father. David Mansell served before I did, in conflicts that don't get named cleanly in the histories, in places that look different depending on which decade's map you're using. He came home from all of it with his sense of humor intact, and his anger converted into something quieter and more functional, patience that I've spent my whole life trying to understand, and a mechanical intelligence that means he can look at any space and immediately begin seeing it as a system of pressures and counterforces, loads and channels, points of stress and points of strength. He also had, in the trunk of his car, several items that I am not going to describe in detail, given the federal context of this document. Point is, when I told him we needed to make the park ready, he went to the car and came back with a yellow legal pad, and he sat on the porch step and started a list. The dog sat next to him and watched the pen move, which is more attention than most people give a planning process. Lendina's declaration came through Wyatt the next morning. He called from a diner on the edge of town, sitting in a booth, his voice doing the thing voices do when a person has been afraid for so long that fear has become a kind of weather. Always present, calibrated to, rather than reacted against. He told me she was sending people, that she'd declared war on my family in the specific terms that people who operate at her level use, which are not metaphorical. I told him I appreciated the heads up. He told me he wanted to help, that he was done, that whatever it cost, he'd pay his share. I thought about Wyatt, about the specific shape of his position, a man who'd inherited a life he hadn't chosen and spent years looking for a door that kept moving. I understood him. I didn't entirely trust him, because trust is something you build on actions, not statements. And I'd only known him through intermediaries. But I understood him, and that was a foundation to work from. I told him we needed the park, he said. I know the tunnels better than anyone alive. I told him, good, come find my father. I moved Becca and the kids and the dog to a hunting lodge 12 miles east of town. A place the barber had vouched for, a man who owed the barber a favor of the kind that generates reliable motivation, set back in the pines where you couldn't see it from any road. I didn't like sending them away. Becca didn't want to go. She looked at me in the motel parking lot, with the kids in the car and the dog watching from the back window, and she said, "This is not the vacation I asked for." I told her I knew that. She said, "Come back." I told her I intended to. That's not a promise I make lightly, because I understand the weight of it. I meant it in the specific way that you mean something when you've decided you're going to make it true regardless of the cost. What I didn't know, what I found out later, and what I should have known from the shape of who she is, was that she'd already identified the rifle in the lodge's equipment room, and that she knew how to use it, and that she had her own calculations running that had nothing to do with waiting. Harry arrived at the park at 8 that evening. He had a duffel bag I didn't ask about. He found us in the service tunnels. Me, my father, Wyatt, with the legal pad and 3 flashlights, and he stood for a moment taking in the scope of what we were arranging. Then he looked at Wyatt and said, "Nice park." Wyatt said, "Thanks." Harry said, "I like the ball pit." My father explained what he was planning to do with the ball pit. Harry raised his eyebrows. He looked at me. He said, "How many men is she sending?" I told him the number. He said, "Then we need more minds in the ball pit." We worked through the night. There is a specific quality to the hours between midnight and 4 in the morning when you are preparing a space for violence. They are not dramatic hours, they are practical ones. You are making decisions that are essentially engineering decisions. Load, placement, sequence, margin of error, and the fact that the subject of those decisions is human life does not make the math any different. What it does is make you aware of the math in a way you can't set aside, and that awareness has a texture to it that I've learned to work inside rather than against. Wyatt proved himself in those hours. He knew the tunnels the way you know the floor plan of a house you've lived in for decades. Instinctively, without having to think about orientation. He knew which hatches were stiff and which swung clean. He knew which sections of the grid had water damage that made the planking soft underfoot, a detail that mattered because soft planking makes noise, and noise in the wrong place at the wrong time costs people their lives. Moved through the tunnels ahead of us with a headlamp marking the access points we'd use and the ones we'd seal, and my father walked behind him, making notations on the legal pad that I couldn't read in the low light, but which I trusted completely. I asked Wyatt at one point how long he'd known the tunnels. He stopped walking. He turned around. The headlamp made a halo that lit the tunnel wall behind him. He said, "Since I was a kid, my dad used to bring me down here. He called it the backbone. He said everything up top depended on what happened down here." He paused. I think he meant it about plumbing and electrical. But it applies. I thought about that. About Wild Bill Martin, who had built the park legitimately and loved it, and who had borrowed money from the wrong person when, business was thin and never found a way out of the agreement he'd made. About Wyatt, who had inherited the park and the debt and the threat in the same package, the way inheritance works when it goes wrong. About the specific calculus of staying inside something you despise because leaving seems even more expensive. I'd been near versions of that calculation in my own life. I understood the topography of it. Father would have wanted this, I said. Wyatt looked at the tunnel wall for a moment. He said, yeah, he would have. Then he turned back around and kept walking. We finished the main preparations at 3:15. My father sat down on an overturned equipment bucket near the maintenance junction and reviewed the legal pad page by page, touching each item on the list with the tip of his pen. It's a thing he does. A physical confirmation that the mental inventory is complete. I've seen him do it with grocery lists and with plans considerably more consequential than grocery lists. And the process looks identical either way. Harry sat on the floor with his back against the tunnel wall, eyes closed, conserving. He can do that. Shift into a kind of operational stillness that isn't sleep but functions similarly. That lets him come out of it ready rather than simply awake. I've never been able to do it. My mind doesn't have an off switch. It has a rotate function, which is a different thing. I walked the surface one more time alone. The park at 3:30 in the morning has its own quality. The midway was dark except for the security lights at the main gate and the emergency exits, which gave everything a low orange wash. The carousel horses were lit from below by a ground-level accent light that someone had left on, and they stood there in the center of the midway, mid-gallop, going nowhere. And I stood and looked at them for a moment, and thought about Sammy's laugh on the roller coaster and the weight of the pink bear in my hand when I picked it up from the arcade floor. You do the math you have to do. You also hold on to what you're doing the math for. I came back to the tunnel entrance and told my father and Harry to rest for an hour. Harry didn't open his eyes. My father carefully tore the completed pages from the legal pad and folded them into his breast pocket, a habit so ingrained it was automatic. Shh. He was asleep in 4 minutes. I sat on the equipment bucket and I watched the tunnel entrance and I waited for dawn. I should tell you what Becca was doing that night, because I found out about it later and it's part of the story. She'd gotten the kids to sleep around 10. Sammy easily, Brady, with the application of a specific firmness that she'd spent 17 years calibrating, the exact register between serious and reassuring that gets a teenager to stop catastrophizing without feeling dismissed. The dogs slept between their beds. The lodge was warm, and the pine trees outside were a sound rather than a sight, the kind of presence that occupies the room without demanding attention. She waited until she was sure both of them were down. Then she got up. The lodge had an equipment room off the mudroom, the kind of room where the man who'd owned the place stored what he needed for deer season. Becca opened the door and turned on the light and looked at what was in there with a methodical eye. She'd grown up with a father who hunted. She'd been dismissive of it as a teenager and had subsequently revised that position as an adult. The way you revise positions that were formed more from social calculation than from considered thought. She knew what she was looking at. She took the .308 from the cabinet, checked the action, found the ammunition in the drawer where it logically had to be, and loaded it. She spent an hour at the window, at the back of the lodge, in the dark practicing her sight picture. She wasn't sighting in the rifle. That requires daylight and targets. She was practicing the discipline of it. The breath control. The way you float the reticle on a point and let your body settle rather than forcing stillness. Because forced stillness isn't steady. Father had taught her that when she was 14, a fact she had never mentioned to me because it had never come up. And because Becca is not a person who volunteers information she doesn't think you need yet. She went to sleep at 2 in the morning with the rifle on the floor beside the bed and woke up at 4:30. When her internal clock told her she needed to be moving. She drove back to Plummerville, in the dark, with the rifle across the back seat, and she found a position at the park entrance with a sight line to the midway, and she waited. She did not tell me any of this until 3 days after the barbecue, and when she told me, I asked her what she'd been thinking. She said, I was thinking that you were going to need something at a distance, and that Harry had the close work covered. I said, You could have told me, she said. You would have argued. She was right. I would have argued. And she would have been right anyway. I want to describe the park in its prepared state because I don't think you can understand what came next without understanding the space we'd made. Wild Bill's majestic midway was 40 acres of nostalgia and peeling paint. And what Wyatt knew, what no one coming in from outside would know, was that the underground layout did not match the surface. The service tunnels ran in a grid beneath the midway, with access hatches every 30 meters, which meant the ground itself was permeable if you knew where to open it. The ball pit in the children's area sat over a utility junction with vertical clearance on all four sides. The waterslide tower had structural columns that could be reached from below without going through the ride itself. The funhouse had a mirror corridor that turned a 6-meter hallway into an apparent infinity, disorienting in daylight, genuinely dangerous in the dark when you're moving fast. My father looked at all of it the way he looks at things. He moved through it with the legal pad, and he planned it the way you plan something you want to be definitive, not provisional. By 3 in the morning we had addressed the ball pit, the service tunnel junctions on the east and west approaches, the funhouse corridor, the main gate loading bay, and the waterslide tower. Harry had specific contributions to each placement that way incorporated without discussion, because Harry's contributions to tactical planning are not the kind you debate. Wyatt knew the tunnel network well enough to seal 3 of the 4 main external entry points from below, which meant anyone coming in from the north and west would funnel whether they intended to or not. Walked the whole thing twice. Then I found a bench near the clay carousel and sat for a while and let myself think. There is a type of person who is built for the situation I was in. Not trained, plenty of people are trained, built, constitutionally suited to the cold geometry of it, able to see a space as a system of outcomes and not as a place where children eat cotton candy and grandfathers win stuffed alligators at ring toss. I am that type of person. I've never been fully comfortable with that fact. But on that bench, with the carousel horses frozen mid-gallop above me, and the park dark and still around me, I made my peace with it. Whatever I am, I was going to use it completely, and without apology, for the people at the lodge in the pines. I radioed Harry. He was in the south tunnel, he said. You ready? I told him I was. He said, don't lose any more fingers. I told him I'd do my best. Lendina's people came at dawn. They came in 3 groups. North Gate, East Fence Line, Service Road from the highway, trying to cover approaches simultaneously, the way professional operations do when they have numerical confidence. 41 men, the barber told me after. A number that sounds significant, until you understand that 41 men moving through unfamiliar ground toward 4 people who know every access point, every sight line, every pressure plate is not an advantage. It's a coordination problem. And coordination is the first thing to fail when the first thing goes wrong. The first thing went wrong at the east fence line. The men coming in from the east were moving fast. The way you move when you have numbers, and you want the numbers to matter. Fast is usually correct. Fast is usually right. Fast assumes that you understand the ground faster than the ground can be used against you. These men were professionals. They'd done this before. They moved with the specific economy of people who have performed this type of entry enough times that it's become procedural. What they hadn't accounted for was that the east fence line, for the last 16 hours, had been something other than a fence line. It had been a problem that my father had thought about the way he thinks about all problems, which is, where do the forces go? And what happens when you redirect them? I was in the midway when the east fence line went. I felt it through the grooves before I heard it. A vibration that ran up through the soles of my boots and into my knees. And then the sound came after. And then the second sound. And then the silence that comes after that kind of sound, which is a particular silence. The men who'd come through the main gate were mine to deal with. There were 11 of them, and they had the gate's width to funnel them. A classic problem. In any confined approach, you don't fight the number, you fight the geometry. The geometry at the main gate was good for the person who was already inside it and had chosen the positions. I won't catalog every minute. The mechanics of it matter less than what it felt like, which was deliberate. Like following a plan that had enough margin to absorb the parts that deviated from it, which is the only kind of plan worth making. My father's planning had the quality that good engineering always has. It accounted for what it didn't know by building in redundancy, so that when a variable came in wrong, the system didn't collapse, it adapted. There was a man near the ticket booth who was better than the others. I could tell by the way he moved, by the way he covered his partner's transition, by the way he'd already identified the problem with the main gate approach before the others had. Professional operators recognize each other the way musicians recognize each other. There's a rhythm to the movement that amateurs can't produce. He was the one I watched, because he was the one who was going to find the angles I hadn't fully accounted for. He found one. There's a gap between the ticket booth and the first fence panel, about 18 inches, that I'd dismissed as too narrow to use. Freaky didn't dismiss it. He went through it diagonally, using the fence for cover, and he came up on my flank, in a position that cost me a hard impact to the ribs. Not a bullet, but the kind of close quarters contact that takes something from you and keeps him down. But it took longer than it should have, and it cost me the position I'd been holding, which meant I had to move. The funhouse corridor was next. 2 men, thinking the mirror effect would work in their favor. It never works in your favor if you're moving fast through it, because your reflection is always exactly as confused as you are, and you can't read your reflection the way you can read a real threat. I was at the far end of the corridor, in a position I'd identified when my father and I had walked the park the night before. It was a simple position. It was enough. The ball pit. When the first group came through the children's area, the sound it made was not the sound I'd expected. I had expected the sound of what it was. What it sounded like instead was something definitive, and the silence after it was different from the silence before, and I didn't spend any time on it. You train yourself not to spend time on it. The time comes later. In the middle of the night, in a house where everyone is asleep, and that's where it belongs. Wyatt in the tunnels, sealing the access hatches, in sequence, moving through the underground grid of his dead father's park, with the purpose of a man who has finally found a use for something he was given against his will. He got shot in the leg in the second hour, a through and through on the outer thigh, something that hurts significantly more than people who haven't experienced it expect, the kind of wound that makes every subsequent step a decision you have to consciously make. And he kept making the decisions, each hatch in sequence exactly as planned. I found out about the wound later. He hadn't told anyone, hadn't asked for anyone to cover his section while he dealt with it. He'd just kept going. Harry in the East. I'll say this about Harry. He is not a theatrical person. He doesn't perform. He does the work that needs doing, with the economy of someone who has a very clear internal accounting of what's necessary and what isn't. And the katana is an extension of that economy. A tool that, in the right hands, on the right terrain, is more efficient than the alternatives. Touche was Lendina's primary enforcer, a man whose reputation was the kind that organizations maintain at significant expense because the reputation itself does work before a single shot is fired. He came in from the east approach with 7 of her best, in a formation that told me immediately they'd worked together before. Harry met them in the space between the maintenance shed and the west waterslide tower. I wasn't there for that part. I heard it. The way you hear things happening at a distance and reconstruct them from the pieces of sound that carry. I heard when it ended. Harry, when I found him afterward, was leaning against the maintenance shed with a cut above his ear and a ruined jacket, and the equanimity of a man who has decided what he thought about something and is finished thinking about it. He was drinking water from a bottle he'd found somewhere in the park. He looked up when I came around the corner, and he looked at my ribs, and he said, "You're favoring the left." I told him I was aware. He handed me the water bottle. I was in the main midway with my father, and we were doing what we do, and the hours had a quality to them that I can only describe as efficient. Not fast, but without waste. Each movement connected to the next in the way that my father's planning had intended. The park was being systematically used against the people who'd come to use it against us, which is the best kind of plan. Not clever, just correct. There was a point, near the end, where the majority of her people were down, and we'd done what we'd planned to do with the prepared positions, and I was on one knee near the carousel. Something had hit my ribs. Not a bullet, but the kind of impact that makes breathing feel like a negotiation you're losing. My father was down across the midway, not dead. I'd confirmed that, but down and still. Wyatt was down. Harry was somewhere in the east I couldn't see. The last group of Lendina's men came through the main gate, and then Lendina walked in behind them. I want to tell you about Lendina, because she deserves accuracy. She was not what I had been expecting, though I'd had limited time to form an expectation. Small. 60-something. She wore a jacket I would have called elegant in a different context. She walked through what had been her empire. Through the smoke and the silence of the prepared park. Past the things that were broken and burning. With the composure of a person who has already processed the possibility of loss and found it acceptable. That specific composure is the most dangerous kind. Not people who are afraid of losing. They fight with an urgency that makes them readable. The ones who've made peace with it are something else. They've removed the variable that most people can't remove, which gives them a clarity that reads as cold and probably is. She walked up to where I was kneeling, and she looked at me with the assessment of someone who has dealt with problems for a long time and recognizes when a problem is more expensive than anticipated. She said, in the conversational register, "Nobody." I told her that was what they called me. She said I'd cost her 20 years. Not angry. Stating a fact, she raised her gun. The shot came before she fired. I heard it from behind me and to the right. Wyatt. From the ground, getting one round off through the compounded difficulties of a leg wound and a very long morning, and it caught the woman next to Lendina before anyone could move. The woman's partner went for Wyatt, and then the second shot came. Different caliber, different direction, from the park entrance. And Lendina took a tranquilizer dart in the chest, and another one in the eye, in rapid succession, and she sat down on the midway concrete with a force that had nothing dignified about it. And her gun bounced off the ground. I looked toward the entrance. Becca was standing there. She had the lodge rifle across her chest, a .308. Bolt action, the kind of rifle that requires real practice to use well from that distance. And she had clearly been practicing more than I'd known about. She was wearing Sammy's hoodie because it had been cold at dawn, and it was the first thing she'd grabbed. She looked at me across the midway with an expression I recognized. The specific expression she'd worn for 4 years when she waited for me in the kitchen at 2 in the morning. I know exactly what I married. I am here anyway. The last wave of men came through the north service gate. I looked at my father. He was already moving, 73 years old and already on his feet. And the legal pad was in the carousel booth where he'd left it, and he had memorized every item on it. And the last item on it was the North Gate Junction and the relay box he'd left in the carousel booth underneath the pad. He detonated it from that box. The north end of Wild Bill's its majestic midway went up in a column of fire and concussive pressure that I felt in my teeth. Becca and I went into the nearest pool, which was the lagoon pool beside the carousel, because that was the closest available cover, and the water was cold and still from the night before. We came up out of it together, and the surface of the water was warm from the heat, and we looked at where the north gate had been. Lendina was still sitting on the concrete. She had a small, strange smile. The tranquilizer was pulling her under, and she knew it. And she seemed to find it acceptable in the same way she'd found everything else acceptable. She looked at the fire. She looked at Becca. She looked at me. Then her eyes closed. The fire took her and the men behind her before anyone could have reached them. The carousel music did not start up. It was never going to start up again. Wild Bill's majestic midway was in significant structural portions no longer a park, it was a site. The south end was intact, and the children's area was intact, except for the ball pit, and the funnel cake stand on the main strip was entirely undamaged, which seemed appropriate. The federal agents arrived 40 minutes later. They were efficient, and they were polite in a careful way of people who are waiting for the situation to clarify before they decide how impolite they need to be. They put us in a van and drove us to a hangar about 30 miles north of Plummerville, and they sat across from us with yellow legal pads and asked the same question in configurations that got more creative over time. Hutch and Becca sat together on folding chairs. Plum was in her lap. Father, was on a folding chair of his own, refusing a stretcher with the specific authority of a man who has been through significantly worse and is not about to begin accepting gurneys at this stage of his life. Harry was there before we were, somehow with coffee, and the expression of a man who has no particular concerns about the current situation. Wyatt was in a medical tent getting his leg addressed. He'd walk fine in 6 weeks. Brady and Sammy were at the lodge, with people the barber vouched for, not yet fully understanding the scope of what had happened. That was fine. There was time for understanding. The important thing was that there was time. The agents asked who I was. I told them I was nobody. One of them rubbed his eyes. The other wrote it down, and then looked at what he'd written, and wrote something else next to it. Then one of their phones rang. I watched the agent's face go through a specific sequence of expressions: surprise, then recalibration, then the shuttered professional blankness of someone receiving instruction from well above their authority level. He said yes 3 times. He hung up. He looked at his partner with an expression that communicated significant information efficiently. They excused themselves and went outside. They let us go 10 minutes later, without further questions. I don't know who made that call. The barber, possibly. Or the layer above the barber. Or the layer above that in the architecture that once had my name on a file, and then decided it was more valuable to not have my name on anything at all. It doesn't matter. The mechanism isn't the point. Point is that we walked out of the hangar into the morning light, and Becca held my hand, and it didn't feel like an obligation. 3 weeks later, we had a barbecue. Backyard. A Tuesday afternoon, in late summer, the kind of light that takes its time. Becca had strung lights along the back fence, even though it wasn't dark yet, because she'd wanted them there. And there was no longer any good reason not to have a thing you want when you can have it. That's a lesson she's been teaching me for years. I'm a slow learner, but I get there. My father was at the grill, wearing the apron that says Grill Sergeant. A gift from Sammy 3 birthdays ago, worn by David Mansell with complete seriousness on every occasion since. The stuffed alligator was on the porch railing. He had named it Bill, after Wild Bill, which seemed right. Brady moved the folding table without being asked. He just picked it up and moved it to where it needed to be and went back to what he was doing. That's a small thing that isn't a small thing. There's a version of Brady that might have spent the rest of the summer being difficult about everything. Having been through what he'd been through. He didn't choose that version. I noticed. Sammy was showing Harry her collection of snow globe magnets from the Plummerville gift shop. She'd bought them on the first day, before everything had gone sideways. Harry was examining each one with the same gravity he brings to everything. He held the carousel one up to the light and turned it and said, "Is this accurate?" Sammy told him the horses were real. He nodded and handed it back carefully. The dog was in a patch of sun near the fence, doing nothing in particular, with complete commitment. Wyatt came for about an hour. He was on a crutch. He brought a bottle of something 15 years old that my father was visibly pleased about. And he shook my hand, and he looked like a man who had taken a full breath for the first time in years. He was looking at selling what remained of the park. The South Third, the children's area, the funnel cake stand, to a family in Plummerville who'd been interested for years. He had other plans he was working through, a future that didn't belong to anyone else's debt. He said, before he left, standing in the yard, "I kept thinking, in those tunnels, who does this? Brings their whole family somewhere, and then just fights their way out." I thought about it. "Didn't fight my way out," I said. "My family fought their way out. I just made sure they could." He considered that. He looked at Becca across the yard, and at my father at the grill, and at Sammy with the snow globe magnets. He nodded slowly. He shook my hand again, and he left. The afternoon moved the way good afternoons move. Slowly, without urgency, the light going gold in the trees. Becca came out of the house with a bowl of potato salad and stopped next to me for a moment, looking at the yard, at Sammy and Harry, and the dog and my father with his alligator on the porch rail. She said quietly, not looking at me, "Next year, somewhere boring," I told her absolutely. She handed me the potato salad and went back inside. I stood in the yard of the house I live in, with the life I built from materials I didn't entirely choose, and I thought about Plummerville and the carousel in the dark. And the conversation I'd had with myself on that bench at 3 in the morning. Ever I am, it's useful. Not noble, not clean, not the version of yourself you put in a frame. Useful. The kind of thing the world sometimes needs in a room. Quietly, until it doesn't need it anymore. And then you come back to the yard and stand in the late summer light and watch the people you'd bleed for eat potato salad. My father turned from the grill and held up his tongs with the authority of a man who has been right about cooking times his entire life and knows it. 2 minutes, he said. We sat down at the table. That was enough. That was exactly enough.